Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on A.W.O.L. This is I guess it's supposed to be a tactical first-person shooter developed by ShotSpark Studios that was released for free on Steam last year in September. After quite a long time in development, I remember seeing bits and pieces about this, what was originally a mod actually, and while I haven't really been following its development, I did see bits and pieces of it keep popping up over the years. And now it's gotten its full release on Steam as a standalone game, not as simply a mod. And it's available for free to boot. But here's the thing. Free or not, once you release a standalone game on any storefront, you are opening yourself up to a different type of criticism than if you were to release, say, a mod on a modding website. And don't get me wrong, there are mods out there that rival or even exceed the quality of even sometimes major releases. But that's not the point here. The point here is that A.W.O.L started life as just a Duke 3D mod, more or less. It was being built on eDuke32, and it's still, of course, built on eDuke32. But instead of being released as a mod for an existing game, it has been released as a full, standalone game on Steam, even if it is free. And unfortunately for everyone involved, it did not release on Steam in a very good state. More specifically, they uploaded the wrong build of the game, which resulted in some absolute hilarity. If you're curious about how that version of the game was, go ahead and watch Icarus's video on A.W.O.L Heart of Jankiness, because it is just an absolute treat. Anyway, this is something that they actually fixed pretty quickly, and they put the proper build up there. And I kind of wish they hadn't, because that version of the game was something that we don't get a whole lot of these days. Something that is so bad it is hilarious. But like I said, they very quickly replaced that with the actual release version that they intended to put up. So what exactly do we have here? Well, A.W.O.L is a very weird game, because it is advertised as a first-person mil-spec shooter developed using the build engine. And I'm not really sure what that's supposed to mean. Does mil-spec mean that it's a hardcore tactical first-person shooter? Does it mean that it's a mil-sim? Like, what does mil-spec shooter actually mean? Well, I really don't know, but what A.W.O.L actually is ostensibly a tactical first-person shooter with squad commands, so more along the lines of something like, say, Rainbow Six or Ghost Recon, than your typical build engine first-person shooter where it's all action all the time. Here's the thing. Tactical first-person shooters are not all that common anymore, and when they are made, they're usually made in a multiplayer context, stuff like Squad or Hell Let Loose or Ready or Not or things like that, where it's a slower-paced, more methodical first-person shooter where you have to work together with your team in order to succeed. The last time we actually got a single-player focused tactical first-person shooter was, if I'm remembering correctly, 2008, when we got the likes of Rainbow Six Vegas 2 and Brothers in Arms Hell's Highway. So it's been a pretty long time, and remember that those were made on more modern engines with more advanced AI than the build engine. The developers of A.W.O.L really had their work cut out for them in making a tactical first-person shooter in the build engine, because the build engine was just not made for that kind of thing. It was made for classic old-school first-person shooter action. And honestly, it's a really janky engine to begin with, so even just making a classic old-school first-person shooter on it is a pretty hefty task, even before you have to basically rewrite the AI code in the engine to support squad commands. That's obviously not to say it can't be done, but it is to say that it's a very difficult task. Did the developers of A.W.O.L manage to achieve this? Well, on the most basic level, yeah, they did. There are squad commands, and they do something. As in, you can switch your squad between aggressive, stealth, and follow modes. If you have them in follow mode, they will stick fairly close to you. If you have them in stealth mode, they basically just stand around and don't do anything. And if you have them in aggressive mode, they will run around the map like headless chickens and try to blast anything that gets in their way. And that is the extent of the squad command system in A.W.O.L. There are a few problems with this. The first of them is that because you have no finer control over your squad mates than just putting them in a very basic mode of function, they are extremely unreliable. And that is putting it very lightly in the case of A.W.O.L, because A.W.O.L has some of the worst squad AI I have ever seen in a first-person shooter, whether it's a proper tactical shooter or even just a first-person shooter in general. They will stand in front of solid barriers and shoot at enemies, obviously never hitting them because their rounds are just going into the barrier. They will run directly in front of enemies and let themselves get shot. They will get stuck on random things in the environment. They will try to climb walls, getting stuck in a loop of just continually jumping into walls or corners to try to get up them or around them. I'm not entirely sure, but whatever the case, they'll just get stuck on them. They will run directly in front of you when you are trying to shoot at enemies, and if there were friendly fire in this game, it would make the game completely impossible, seeing as how you would just blast the living crap out of your AI squad mates, and they would blast the living crap out of you because they just keep shooting at enemies regardless of whether you're between them or not. Your squad is not so much an actual squad that you command as it is a force of chaos that you unleash upon the game and just hope it works in your favor. And most of the time, it really doesn't. And to make matters even more confusing, the enemy AI is either as stupid or somehow even stupider than your squad is. They will do basically all of the really stupid things that you see your squad mates doing, only they won't try to jump up walls. And if it weren't for the fact that the enemies can do ridiculous amounts of damage to you, are pinpoint accurate from any distance, and tend to be bullet sponges, they really wouldn't pose much of a threat to you and you'd be able to just completely breeze through the game. That's certainly not to say the game is overwhelmingly difficult or anything, but it can be really frustrating watching your squad mates just run directly in front of enemies, do absolutely nothing, and then you get mowed down by the enemy that they ran directly in front of. And to make matters worse, you can't really rely even on your own performance as a first-person shooter player because the gunplay is really inconsistent in this. You're supposed to be able to go for headshots to drop an enemy much more quickly, whether it be one shot or even just a couple of shots if they're a more heavily armored enemy. But unlike, say, Ion Fury, which actually dialed that mechanic in pretty well, here, the hitboxes are just really inconsistent, the actual damage you seem to do with your weapons is really inconsistent. Some enemies will just be total bullet sponges, where other enemies of the exact same type will just go down in one or two shots. And even something as simple as trying to aim down your weapon's sights in order to make your shots more accurate is frustrating because the muzzle flash or muzzle flip of your gun constantly interferes with your ability to keep your shots on target. Not because it's difficult to aim in this or anything, but because it just obscures the screen with a muzzle flash or the animation of your gun flipping, so you just can't see what you're doing. The end result of all that is something that catastrophically fails at being a tactical first-person shooter, and even really just fails at being a first-person shooter in general. I mean, they can't even get the fundamental first-person shooter mechanics down. And it certainly doesn't live up to what is described on the Steam store page. I mean, they say the enemies are intelligent, they'll take cover, hide, ambush, and work together to try to take your team out, when they just don't. Or the so-called bespoke sprite and texture art with serious retro FPS style. I mean, sure, it's retro FPS style, but it's certainly not bespoke when you have things like manhole covers being used for not only vinyl records, but the adjustment dials on Bunsen burners. And bonus points for the nightmare level that is completely out of place in A.W.O.L and was clearly just put in because the developers really liked the nightmare sequence in Max Payne. There is absolutely no escaping the fact that this really does feel like a mod that should have released around 20 years ago. If it had released as a mod around 20 years ago, it actually would have been pretty cool because they were pushing the build engine into areas that it really wasn't meant to be. And while it doesn't work at all, it still would have been at least a neat experiment that you could say, oh, well, it was just modders trying something different, and, I mean, it doesn't really work, but it's just a mod. Well, here's the thing. A.W.O.L is a standalone game. It was released on the Steam storefront, and even though it is available as a free download, you still have to hold it to a higher standard than, well, it would have been neat as a mod experiment 20 years ago. But over the past 20 years, we've seen the modding and indie development scene dramatically change. The kinds of things that indie developers are able to make now are just absolutely insane, even on older engines. I mean, look at something like Sulaco. That's made on the GZ Doom engine, which is just the Doom engine with some more modern features. And even knowing that, it's incredibly hard to actually believe it just because of how much more crazy Sulaco is than what you would think of for the Doom engine. Then you look at something like A.W.O.L, which on paper is a really cool idea, and unfortunately it just plays and looks like a 20-ish year old mod. You're just left wondering what this could be like if it, well, actually worked. It had potential to be something incredibly cool, but what we ended up getting was something that's just an absolute mess. And that's just a shame, because again, it could have just been something so much cooler if it actually worked. That said, I do hope the experience of making A.W.O.L was valuable for the developers, that they learned from their mistakes, and that if they go to make a future project, that it ends up being better because of the mistakes they made in A.W.O.L. But as far as being a playable, enjoyable experience for a general audience or tactical shooter fans or whatever, it's just impossible for me to recommend. There'll still be a link in the video description box to where you can grab it on Steam if you're interested. I mean, there's nothing stopping you. It is a free download after all. But just understand what you're getting yourself into if you do decide to give it a try. Thanks for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine. I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.